So, Catchment Rivers Trust. We're a river conservation charity and we aim to protect, restore and enhance the rivers of our catchment. And we mostly cover South Yorkshire and North East Derbyshire and a teeny tiny bit of Nottinghamshire. And our ambition is to reconnect people, communities and decision makers back to our rivers and its heritage, be that natural, cultural, built or industrial. So as I say, I'm project manager. So in my day-to-day job, I sort of keep an overview of whatever we have going on, really. And the trust does all sorts of things to try and restore and improve how our river catchment works. So for example, here is one of our fish passers on one of the, this is Masborough in Rotherham, and these help migrating salmon back into the catchment. And the salmon haven't lived properly in the river for probably a couple of hundred years, but all the fish pass building over the last 20 years by several organisations has meant we've had some success over the last couple of years, and we've actually seen salmon back at their first spawning grounds in Sheffield. We've also got a programme of natural flood management. Here are some of our volunteers and staff putting in leaky dams further up the catchment. We do citizen science, we create walking routes, run community events and activities, and school sessions, and we work with a lot of volunteers to do so. Many of whom are on the call today. Hello, everybody. Now, the pandemic has disrupted us quite a lot, really. It's fair to say. We're used to being out and about, and we've just not been able to. But we're keeping as much engagement going as we possibly can, and our online talks are part of that. So thank you all for coming this evening. Now, the Rivers Trust itself is made up of grassroots local trusts, and we've got a national umbrella body. And Catchment has been a Rivers Trust for just over 10 years, and a bit informally before that. And what I really love about the Rivers Trust is it brings together people from all different backgrounds. So we're a sort of a medium-sized trust, and we've got 7 staff, about the same number of trustees and dozens of volunteers. And within that, we've got ecologists and hydrologists, natural flood management experts and fisheries experts, and also people with no formal background in the catchment management and issues, but have that passion to want to make a difference to their local community. So for me, my route into the Rivers Trust was from the heritage side of things and being a boater. So I'm from Goole, and that's where I'm talking to you from this evening aboard my narrowboat. That's Ethel Rosina. And I should point out, in the context of this talk, she's not historic, she's just old, and I think there's a subtle difference there. So I did my degree in archaeology and heritage management, and that comes in really useful when we're working on some of the historic structures. But I've always worked for sort of waterways organisations or industrial heritage more widely. So I was museum manager at the Yorkshire Waterways Museum, and that's what really planted the seed of interest in the history of the rivers. And I worked a little while for Kelham Island Museum in Sheffield, and I did a short stint at Canal and River Trust before joining Catchment Rivers Trust. And I'm very glad I did, because I do love it, and every day we get to do something that's a positive step forward for our environment and our rivers. So my remit here in talking about historic boats is really just a long-standing interest, being involved in organisations that have operated historic boats, done a little bit of boating myself in my time, and I do have a family connection as well, which I'll tell you about a little bit later. So I'm mostly talking about from sort of 1800 onwards, and my knowledge is more around sort of the ooze end of the catchment, which is top geographically but bottom of the catchment, rather than the sort of Chesterfield end of things. So that's more or less what I'm focusing on this evening. So let's dive in. I'll orientate us first. So this is the Don Catchment. This is the patch our trust helps to look after. And these are the rivers of the catchment as they stand today. I'm going to be doing a talk next week about how the catchment sort of ended up as it did. So I won't go into too much detail here and end up repeating myself later on. But I'm in Goole, which is up at the top there. And then the main river is the Don, which comes through Doncaster, clues in the name there, and through Rotherham up to Sheffield, and that starts up near Dunford Bridge. And then we've got the Dearne, which runs through Barnsley, and the Rother, which branches off from Rotherham and goes up to Chesterfield. Now, the Don Catchment, when you sort of look on the UK map, it's very inland, isn't it, really? So in looking at the development of boats, it's sort of important to put that in the context of the Don being directly linked to the Humber via the Ouse. So I've got this lovely old aerial image here, and running up the left-hand side there, sort of north, that's the Don, known as the Dutch River, where it sort of comes to Goole. And then that sweeping big meander there is the Ouse. You can actually see some boats on it there. I think this is probably 1940s, that aerial photograph. And then the Ouse, if you keep going, turn left, you come up to the mighty Humber there. And this, being connected to the Humber, really informed and influenced the design of the boats that you would see in the catchment. And the main driving factor for that was the trade going on. So thinking about pre-canal, so before the canals were built, you could get a boat inland about as far as Doncaster from the Ouse, and that's because that was the extent of the tidal limit. The Don is tidal all the way up to Doncaster. But more often than that, you could sort of get to about Fish Lake regularly. And there were lots of small wharves in many of the riverside villages. So nowadays, the high tide at Goole can be 6+ meters, and then at low tide, it goes to like a couple of foot, something like that. And obviously, the further inland you get, the shallower the river. And beyond Doncaster, it's not tidal. So these are the sorts of boats that would have been typical of the time. These are the Keels, and a similar one is the Sloops. So although narrowboats like mine are prevalent in the area now for leisure, that's not the tradition in this area. You wouldn't have seen the narrowboats, you know, with the sort of fancy roses and castles designs and things like that up here, really. That was more of a Midlands tradition. The boats were built really as an optimum size for the Humber, but then to be able to go out to the coast, but also inland as far as they could get. Now, it's said the design was an ancestor of the Viking longships, but I'm not so sure about that one. I think that might be the Victorians being the Victorians and been in history. Who knows? Maybe they were. So in terms of inland waterways vessels, the Keels and the Sloops are quite wide, just for sort of scale there. You don't see many pictures with people on, but just for scale there, you can sort of see how big they were. It had to be built really strongly to cope with the Humber tides, which can be horrendous at times, and to be sort of stable enough. Originally, they would have been made from wood, and then sort of from the turn of the 1900s around there, started to be made from metal. And they had a flat bottom. They didn't have sort of that shaped keel, they had a flat bottom. And that's because they were working the Humber tides and doing quite long trips. that meant you'd have had to rest on a sandbank at some point at low tide, probably. Whether that was by design or not quite by design. I'm sure some people got caught out. I've certainly been caught out on some tides. And having that sort of flat hull also meant that they could get into the small havens up and down the Humber with the shallow rivers. And the front and the back of them were what's called bluff, almost sort of squared off. So they don't have what you would think of as a typical point at the front, which is a little bit odd considering they did have to punch through all these tides and things, but they were built for sort of maximum cargo capacity. Every little bit of them was, filled with cargo. So they made good use of all the space available to them, even if that meant a bit of a bumpy ride. And I've had some bumpy rides on the Humber in my time. So the basic design of a keel and a sloop is roughly the same, sort of from the decks down, but it's the sails that set them apart. So this is a sloop, and sloops have triangular sails. These would have been seen, I think, more in the open waters around the Humber, but they did come inland, and that big surface area of the sail meant they were able to catch a lot of the wind by manoeuvring that sail, and which meant they were quite nippy vessels, these ones, but they needed the space to be able to swing that boom out to catch the wind properly. And here is another example of a keel. Sorry, a sloop, triangular sail, sloop. And this is off a painting by quite a well-known local artist called Reuben Chappell. And Reuben Chappell, he was born and lived in Goole, and he used to sort of sit at the end of the dock waiting for these boats to come in, and then he used to sell these paintings to the crew and the masters. He painted thousands of these in his time, and apparently he used to have the Humber and the background and the basic, because every one of these keels and sloops were pretty much the same. He sort of had sketched in the outline of the boat, and then when he sold one, he literally sort of coloured it into the to the right right paint colours and put the name on the pennant flag up the top there. And the little boat you can see it's towing on the back is a coggy boat. The keels and the sloops would have had one of those coggy boats, so that if they were at anchor or on the sandbanks, they had a means of getting to the land. So they're the sloops, and then these are the keels. So the keels have the square sails, and you'd have seen these a little bit further inland. Sometimes they had a big mainsail and a topsail to try and catch as much wind as they could. I'm sure I've seen photographs too of them with two topsails, so 3 sails all in all. And then these were the ones that were adapted when you could get further inland, that have just had sort of a smaller mast with a smaller sail. So if we're saying it wasn't possible to sail further than Doncaster inland on the river, how can we see boats in Sheffield nowadays? Well, that's thanks to the Sheffield and South Yorkshire navigation. And the Sheffield and South Yorkshire had some serious obstacles to overcome to get beyond Doncaster, such as hills. We know how hilly Sheffield is. All the weirs that had been put in the river for the factories and the mills over hundreds of years, and unnavigable stretches of river. But these improved. The navigation of the river was being driven. The improvement was being driven by the mill owners and the merchants of Sheffield. And by improvement, by using the word improvement, I mean helping the navigation. I think we'd argue nowadays that some of the improvements they made to the rivers weren't brilliant for the ecology and the wildlife, but we're talking about historic boats this evening, so in their terms it was an improvement. And Sheffield at the time were sort of intensively producing and manufacturing goods from the Industrial Revolution onwards, and the owners of the factories and the mills and the works recognised that being able to transport goods back out would be beneficial and open up their markets if they could get to the Humber on the boats. So they set about straightening sections of river, building locks up the hills and bypassing the weirs as well. So eventually, in 1819, when the Tinsley Canal opened, you could get a boat into the heart of Sheffield, right from the Humber. Now, up until this point, there wasn't an absolute standard size for a keel or a sloop. They were generally around 70 foot long. But now there were locks and bridges involved, this started to standardise the size of a keel. And this led to a tradition of calling a boat Sheffield-sized. It's a term you still hear on the waterways now, Sheffield-sized barge. So basically, if you wanted to get a boat to Sheffield from the Humber, it had to be no bigger than 61 foot 6 inches long, no bigger than 15 foot 6 inches wide, and no deeper than 7 foot 6. That's because that's the size of the smallest lock. And as you can see there, I realise this is a very grainy picture and it's probably not helping seeing it on Zoom, but you can just about make that boat just goes under that bridge in Sheffield and you can see the people ducking to get under there. There was also West Country sized boats, and that's got nothing to do with the West Country as we know it nowadays. That just meant West Yorkshire and across the Pennines. And similarly, there's the Chesterfield Canal had the cuckoo boats, which was a certain size through their canal. Just going to take a sip of tea. I'm not used to talking this long during lockdown. I'm getting dry throat. But, so, boat building was also a big industry in the area. As you can see there, that's Sheffield, that's Victoria Quays in Sheffield, with all the keels getting loaded. And that, I think, the middle of the screen there, that last arch, I think that's where the Dorothy Pax pub is now. So that's what it used to look like in Sheffield. But boat building was a big industry. And when you sort of look through the registers of all these keels and sloops, there were hundreds of them over the years. And they were nearly all made locally, particularly around places like Thorn, that sort of area, but also way up the system. And it was something that would have been very recognisable to people living near their yards. A regular occurrence to see these boats being launched. But we do know of one example where there was a terrible tragedy that happened at Masborough in Rotherham. And we found out about it when we visited Rotherham Minster. I think we were researching for a heritage walk in the area, and we were in the Minster and saw this memorial, and that's got 64 people on it and 50 of them are children. And what happened was a boat that was newly completed was being launched from Chambers Yard in 1841 at Masborough, which is in the middle of Rotherham. It's just near the fish pass we built, actually. And the barge was called John and William, and it had been built for some owners up in Sheffield. And it was a tradition of that yard and other yards, actually, as well. But this yard used to invite people to be on board when it was launched for a fun day out. Except on this occasion, there were too many people aboard. Reports say 150, and the vessel capsized as it hit the water. and people got trapped and killed, despite heroism from onlookers jumping in to try and save people. And that type of boat they were launching was called a billy boy. And that's another type of boat that would have been seen in the area. Billy boys were sort of in a similar vein to the Keels and Sloops, but they were what's called ketch rigged. So that means they had two masts and they're a bit deeper. And it was being that little bit deeper on that occasion that might have made it more unstable going into the water. And this is a depiction from one of the local papers at the time. And the terrible thing was that it was ruled an accidental death. The owner or the builder didn't have to pay compensation, and it was left to the community to pull together to help the families of the victims and to make that memorial. And I think it's quite easy now with some of the the TV programs that you see to sort of get lulled into a sense of it being a gentle romantic occupation, but actually it was full of danger. The local papers are sort of full of reports of crews being lost at sea or in the river, and often it was only a couple of crew working these boats, and I'm told the smaller Sheffield sized ones you could work them single-handed, and it was a really hard way of life. But back to the Sheffield and South Yorkshire navigation, subsequent canals that were built, such as the Stainforth and Keighley and the Ayr and Calder and the Dearne and Dove, really changed movement around the catchment a lot, and you could get to places you traditionally couldn't get to on the rivers. Get hold of any raw material you liked, and have a means of getting your finished goods back out down the system to the Humber, potentially around the coast. And after the port of Gill was built in 1826, to the continent as well. And the Keels and the Sloops were really like the lorries of the day. They were always on the move, moving whatever was needed, whenever it was needed. And as I said, there were hundreds of these. So that's just an example of a billy boy. Funnily enough, there aren't many old photographs of billy boys, and I'm not sure why, but that's Audrey. She's still about somewhere in the country. So the Keels and Sloops did use the canals when they were built, and here is an example of a lovely old photo of a keel with its topsail at the canal bridge at Stainforth. But if you imagine the number of sort of bridges and locks, it wasn't that easy sailing them along the canal, those big sails. So, like you would imagine on some of the narrow canals with the narrow boats, there was some horse drawn and sometimes people drawn. People used to pull them. But it became quite common for keels to be towed in lines with a steam tug. And they were sort of just used as barges, really. And it's that idea of towing that was instrumental in the development of the iconic coal tugs of the Ayr and Calder navigation, nicknamed the Tom Puddings. There we go. There is a line of Tom Puddings. Now, the Tom Pudding system was designed by Thomas Hammond Bartholomew and his son William, and they were engineers to the Ayr and Calder Navigation Company. And these started operating in 1863, and they originally went along the canal to Leeds. But in 1905, they opened a canal junction called the New Junction Canal, and that went to join the Don. And it allowed these Tom Pudding coal tugs right into the South Yorkshire industrial heartlands. And the idea was that coal was loaded into compartments. Now, I think I'm right in saying this is Doncaster. Somebody might recognise it or not, but I'm pretty sure that's Doncaster, with the coal being loaded into one of the Tom Puddings there. And then 18 or 19 of these were strung together and towed along the canal back to Goole. So you can see the train of Tom Pudding pans in the middle there is loaded. If you look carefully, right in the middle, there's someone stood right on the edge of them. And then on the right hand side, that is the empty pans. They'll be going from Goole up to the coal fields. And on the left there, you can see some of the, I don't know if they're Keels or Sloops, it'll be one or the other. So when these sort of trains of Tom Puddings got to Goole, they came to these hoists, and the individual Tom Pudding was lifted up in one of these hoists and tipped over into waiting ships. Sometimes they tipped into the Keels and the Sloops as well, but at this point it was more the sort of big sea-going ships. So the original Tom Pudding tugs were steam powered, which you can see in this one. But then in 1959, a fleet of diesel tugs were commissioned. There we can see this one's called West Riding, and it's at this point they gave them the luxury of a wheelhouse, so they worked good in the weather. And that system of Tom Puddings, the Tom Pudding system of pulling coal, was pretty unique, really, and very iconic, both sort of now and then. There are other examples of sort of tug boats being pulled up and down canals, but this system in the Catchment was so well integrated from pit to port. You know, all the machinery in Goole was run off hydraulics, so the hoists were hydraulic, the cranes were hydraulic, and the capstans, and apparently the parish church organ was on the same system as well. So this system ran right up till 1986. That was when the last coal lift was made. So that was a system that was relatively unchanged for 120 years. So where are all these boats now? Because you don't really see a lot of these historic boats now, or boats other than leisure craft, really. And well, basically, the answer really is that a lot of the trade disappeared. The railways had a big hand to play. They started taking over from the canals. Reduction of coal mining through the 1970s and 80s meant that the Tom Puddings didn't really have much cargo. And eventually lorries took over, as we see them today. So, I mean, there were hundreds of those individual the actual Tom Pudding tubs, and they were all scraps. There you go, you can see them all being burnt up, ready to be sold off for scrap. And there's actually four Tom Puddings left in the world now out of all those hundreds. And one of them is out of the water on display at Goole, at the last remaining coal hoist site. And all 7 of the diesel tugs are in existence in one form or another. I'll tell you about one of them in a minute. And one of the original steam tugs, this is Gillingham on the River Medway in Kent. We got to know her, actually, we were there and we went to see her. She's one of the original steam tugs, and she was called Waterloo, and she was the one they experimented with to see if diesel powered would work. There's not a lot left of her now, and she fills with water in the tide, but just about hanging on there. But I'll tell you a little story about one of the Tom Pudding tugs called Welldale. There she is. So as I mentioned, I previously used to work at the Yorkshire Waterways Museum, and it was part of my job to help look after one of the old Tom Pudding tugs, Welldale, and she was part of the museum collection. And she had a brilliant, dedicated volunteer team, and some of them are on the call actually. Hello everybody. And we got to take Welldale to events and festivals all along the canal, and we used to do trips around Gulsdock on it. But then in 2012, we got the opportunity to take part in the Diamond Jubilee pageant on the Thames to celebrate the Queen's Diamond Jubilee. I think one of my fellow crew members might be on the call as well. Hello, Stevie G, if you're there. It was a chance spot in a newspaper asking for interesting or historic barges to apply to be part of this pageant. And it turned into one of the best adventures I've ever had, really, because we got to take Welldale to the Thames around the coast. And we knew she'd be okay doing that because she was built in Brentford on the Thames in 1959 and brought round the coast to Gull. So she was going home, really. She was having a visit home. So on the pageant, we were allowed 12 people to be on board, but we decided just to take her around with a crew of 4. And I was asked to be one of the crew. And I'd started my day skipper theory qualification earlier that year, but I made sure to get it done quickly and get past, along with my VHF radio course, so I could be a proper member of the crew. So I just wasn't just the tea maker. I wanted to be a proper crew member. As you can imagine, we had an enormous amount of preparation to do to take a Tom Pudding tug from Gull to London, but we got a lot of goodwill along the way. So we got free dry docking in Hull and a survey, and volunteers helped to get her all painted up. And we got a lot of support from donors to fill the tank with diesel and subsidise people getting down to London to meet us. And then we got approached by the BBC to ask if we would be one of the vessels with a live reporter on board. And at this point, Terrified doesn't even begin to cut it. This was a big deal. And we weren't actually sure we were going to get there right up to the week before, because the weather was terrible. It was forecast to be horrendous, and we weren't going to risk going out in anything above a force 4. But with a couple of days to go, the weather window opened, so we went for it. That's us leaving the Humber with the sun setting behind us. So it took us 4 days to get to the Jubilee, because we stopped off in Harwich and then spent a night moored just into the Thames, because it was a really specific time we had to get into the West India docks where we were going to be moored. And then once into West India docks, we had a couple of days before the practice run up to the start line. And what a fantastic couple of days it was. We were warned ahead of time that there weren't any facilities in West India Dock, but when we got there, all the apartments had opened the basements and they'd, given us access to showers and all that kind of thing. And we were in the working boat section, and we were moored up to the next to there was a whole section of Dunkirk little ships, which you can just see some of them in the background. And what an honour to be moored up next to that lot. So the weather in the run up to the event was beautiful, but on the day it absolutely poured it down non-stop. It didn't dampen the atmosphere too much though, but it was just a surreal thing seeing the banks lined with people sort of waving and cheering. I think it said 1 million people were on the banks. A lot of some of our families travelled down to London to see to wave us on as well. So there we were, a Yorkshire tug on the Thames, being broadcasting live to, I dread to think how many millions worldwide, with my only thought being, please nobody swear live on television in front of that many people. And we had volunteers on board who actually worked on Welldale when she was a Tom Pudding tug. Probably one of the proudest things I have ever done. Which makes it all the more poignant that the year after I got made redundant and now the museum shuts. But there we go. That's I don't have many good photos of the Jubilee pageant because I was on the boat, not like looking at it. But this is Gloriana. That was Gloriana, the pageant badge there. So back to the Keels. Where are they all now? Well, considering there were hundreds of them, original Keels are a really rare thing now. I think I'm right in saying there aren't any wooden ones left. I think one of the last wooden ones was the Dorothy Pax from Sheffield, which the pub in Victoria Keys is named after. But there's a few early examples of metal ones left. And quite a lot of them have been lovingly restored. So, as an example, here is Southcliffe. And Southcliffe used to belong to a friend of mine. She was built in 1923 by Dunstan's in Farn, and she's currently in Goole. And when he bought it, the sail had been removed long ago, and she'd been fitted with an engine, which you can see on the right there. Now, a lot of the original sailing keels had engines fitted to them between the wars, between World War I and II. And then during World War II, you could get a grant to convert from sail to have an engine installed, and a lot of them were de-rigged. The sails were taken off at that point, and I guess that was a drive by the government to sort of increase efficiency. A lot of people didn't like it though. They sort of took the grant, put the engine in, but still sailed them. Got a new mast made for Southcliffe, and the new sail was put on. And you can't quite make it out, but I think that's me steering. I think we must have been coming back from the Humber. That's us in the Ouse. And my sole contribution to this restoration was that I sewed the pennant flag at the top there. That's the South Pole. So I think just about the earliest keel still in existence is probably Sobriety. I think I'm right in saying that. There might be a slightly earlier keel. But Sobriety was built in 1910 at Beverley, and she used to be on permanent loan to the Sobriety Project, which ran the Waterways Museum, and she was fitted out as a residential barge in her latter years. And we used to take groups of youngsters on residential trips to places like Leeds and Hull and things like that, and up and down the canal. And we also used to do day trips on the Humber, which was a massive learning curve, that one. But so around sort of, I'd say around the 1940s, it was becoming fairly standard to build them as motor keels rather than a sail on. But they were being built right up into the 1960s. And you can still see a fleet of them if you're at Swinton at Waddington's Yard. They've got a really distinctive mid-blue colouring to them. So working on the keels was very much a family thing. You see the same names cropping up, and they tended to marry sort of within boating communities. It's quite hard to do family history if you've got keelmen or bargees, as they're called up here, in the family, because at census time, they got registered wherever the boat happened to be, and it's quite difficult to pin them down actually sometimes. So some people both owned and operated their keel, but then there were owners that employed a crew, and you only really get owners' names on the registers, and then the people that were actually on them were on the censuses. So it's a bit different, sometimes a bit of a puzzle to sort of piece it all together if you're doing sort of family history research. But there are people that do it. There's a couple of websites that have sort of tracked all the boat families around Thorn, and now they're sort of all interlinked. And a member of the Yorkshire Waterways Heritage Society has been researching some of the names. Now I've got bargees on both sides of the family. So we've got people that used to be in Greenwich, and we think they came to the area for work around Immingham and Hull. And then we've got, on the other side, we've got Keel, I think they were owners and masters. So this is a census return from 1861. And you can see the top line there, it's a census for people that were on board vessels at the night the census was being taken. And you've got to get your eye in a bit on this old Victorian writing, but the top name there is James Harlington, who was master of a keel, and then his wife there below is Hannah Harlington, who was the master's wife. And then they had 2 young kids aboard, one 4 years old and one 2 years old. And that's my great grandma and granddad. And then later that year, my great grandmother Sarah was actually born on that keel in Hull. She married a Thompson, who was a steamship fireman, and their son Frederick was a stoker on a ship. And then their daughter, my nan, because then I started to be descended from the female line, but my nan obviously didn't, at that time, he didn't work really. But then during World War II, I think, she worked in the shipyards, and then my uncle worked in the shipyards. So you can sort of, by tracing the family history, you can sort of see that progression from working on the keels to sort of the keels not being the thing anymore and going on to the steamships. And, you know, I didn't know a lot of this before I started working at the Waterways Museum. It sort of came out later when we were doing the family history research. So maybe things are just in your genes, you never know. But it was the Education Act of 1870 that changed the way of life really for the Keels. Up until then, families were living aboard in cabins. So here is Southcliffe's cabin. They're really lovely, cosy things, but I can't imagine a whole family living in there. And then this is off another, this is an older photograph. That's the sort of opposite view. You had like a little fire, and those are the doors leading into the main cargo bit. But after the Education Act, in 1880, there was an amendment to say that school was mandatory for younger children. And that's when families started to move to living on land rather than purely living on the boats. So places like Thorne and Stainforth had big bargy communities, and some of the names connected to the Keels and the Sloops are really familiar today still from people living in those areas. But it was around that time that a lot of these cabins got taken out so they could be used for more cargo, and they're quite rare, those cabins now, actually. So now the rivers and the waterways are used, well, around here, I think it's better to say they're sort of used predominantly for leisure boating now, really, aren't they? But there are 2 commercial barge operators left. So that's, there's one called Farndale H, which has just started operating, and then this is Exol Pride. She takes oil from Hull to just outside Rotherham, and there she is at Sprotborough, just going under the bridge there. She's just about to go into the lock. She only just fits as well. So yeah, 2 commercial barge operators left. Unfortunately, we've just had a canal breach further up the canal, so boats aren't going anywhere at the minute up there, but hopefully that's a temporary blip. So thank you for listening. If you did want to find out any more, there's loads of stuff online. So the Humber Keel and Sloop Preservation Society are a brilliant organisation. They've got a lovely website with loads of detailed information, and in the normal times you can book and go sailing with them on the Humber. National Historic Ships Register is always worth a good look at. I mentioned the Yorkshire Waterways Heritage Group before. I'm chair of that group, and sort of since the museum closed, there's been a bit of a gap for people in the area. So it's trying to pull together like people that are doing research on boats. So one of the members does research on billy boys, and one's been researching the families. We have an aspiration as well to acquire a historic boat. We've been a little bit hampered by lockdown, unfortunately, but when we're allowed back out again, we'll be picking up on that one. And as I said, my sort of knowledge is more from the ooze part of the catchment. I've not really touched on around Chesterfield, but if you are interested, the Chesterfield Canal Society has a good website as well. And there's quite a lot of publications and books that the Humber Keels and Keelmen by Fred Schofield. He's sort of the oracle of all this, really, because when he was a child, he remembers sort of the old keelmen, so his knowledge was sort of going back maybe 100 years. So that's a great book. And then there's various other ones. If you want to learn more about the Tom Puddings, I'd say the best book is that Railway on the Water. And then Mike Taylor, he's written lots of waterways books. He's done one about Dunstans in Thorn. But I think these are all available, still sort of second hand on eBay and things like that. All good bookshops. And if you'd like to follow any of the work of Don Catchment Rivers Trust, do have a look on our website, dcrt.org.uk. You can sign up to our monthly newsletter there. That's where we tend to put advance notice of things like this out. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and YouTube. And in normal times, you can volunteer for us. There's always things to be done. We've actually got some jobs coming up this year as well. We've got a live one at the minute, and it's a government kickstart placement. So if you know anybody 16 to 24 in receipt of universal credit, interested in a conservation career, get them to get their work coach to refer them to us, and it's a 6-month placement. So this talk was free, thanks to funding from the National Lottery Heritage Fund. If you did want to give a donation, there's a button at the bottom of our website. Our next talk is next Thursday, and that's me again, and I'm doing a flying history of the Don Catchment, sort of from the grand drainage of Bermuda in the 1600s right up to us removing weirs and dams now. And we're going to be doing more on things like natural flood management, so do keep an eye out.